give our friends a moment to join us here. Really excited and looking forward to our webinar this afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Dr. Jamie Mathias, Executive Director of the Texas Latino School Boards Association, an organization dedicated to providing research and resources to educational leaders throughout Texas. We're in the middle of our second webinar series. 2 weeks ago, we explored the gaps that exist in the HEB Excellence in Education Award finalist districts. Last week, for those who tuned in, we looked at the performance of students in the districts of the officers of TASA, the Texas Association of School Administrators, and of TASB, the Texas Association of School Boards. For those who are able to join us next week, we'll come back and examine how it is that students are doing in the districts of the officers of TABC, the Texas Association of Black School Educators, and of the Texas Caucus of Black School Board Members. And finally, 2 weeks from today, we'll be back so that there's no impression that we're picking on anyone. We're going to turn the microscope on ourselves and take a look at the performance of students in the top 20 Latino serving districts in the state of Texas. We have the joy of welcoming Mr. George Scott, a former trustee of the Katy ISD and a former director of the Texas Association of School Boards. How are we doing today, Mr. Scott?
Doing well, raring to go.
So, Mr. Scott, I haven't yet introduced today's topic, but it concerns organizations that have been in our hearts for a long, long time. I remember, well, first of all, to set up the theme for today, we're looking at the academic performance of students who are in the districts of the officers of TALAS, the Texas Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents, and also of MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association. I served MASBA as its executive director for 3.5 lovely years. Loved every moment of working with MASBA as we tried to shift the focus of the culture of MASBA. Admittedly, before I joined MASBA was known as a party organization for trustees. MASBA had always thrown great parties, and I'm sure will always continue to throw great parties, but I tried to focus them instead on student performance. Imagine for a moment if we could just make a difference for the Latinx students who comprise the majority in our Texas public schools. What a powerful impact that would be. Mr. Scott, I remember meeting you. I was part of the board of directors of the Texas Association of School Boards when you joined the board of directors of TASB as a director representing the Katy ISD. And I remember in particular, there was a TASB conference that you attended where you were just glowing about that presentation. And I think that really started this beautiful relationship that the two of us continue to enjoy today. Tell us about your relationship with TASB and with MASBA.
MASBA has an extraordinary part of my heart. And part of that heart is sad because of that experience. I have to step back to put my first meeting with MASBA or my first association with MASBA in context. I ran for the Katy ISD School Board and was accidentally elected by 6 votes. And I ran for one reason, and it was to sue the state of Texas over the issues that we have been documenting for the last 6 weeks and will be for 2 more. Katy ISD is an affluent suburban school district, but it's undergone great changes in the time that I've lived here. Hispanic, Latinx students are the dominant majority ethnicity in Katy now. Might blow people's minds. But when I went on the board, we were hiring a new superintendent. And I got to cast the vote for the guy because I had just come in. And on the night he became superintendent of schools, poor guy, I gave him an 84-page monograph with tables, charts, statewide, Katy ISD, all kinds of stuff. And I said, my goal is to sue the state of Texas, but we can't do this without a superintendent of schools. And I want you to read this. I know you're not going to memorize it, but I want you to read it. And what we're trying to do is to tell a story, Dr. Matthias. We know the numbers. You and I have gone through the numbers, and maybe we'll spend 15 or 20 minutes here trying to tell the story. We at KDISD was literally moving down the path to sue the state of Texas, to seek to enjoin it from giving this dishonest, corrupt, malevolently dishonest test and accountability system that harms so many at-risk kids, disadvantaged kids. And I had a superintendent of schools that bought into it. He was fully engaged in it. We had hired attorneys to begin the process. They had retained independent experts to start looking at some of the 84 pages and more. And we were literally moving down that path when politics, as you know, can take over. The superintendent was politically mortally wounded. He was no longer superintendent, and that mission died. It died on the vine. And it explains why you and I are back together, trying to put something back together. But it was not dead when I was appointed to TASB. And I come to this meeting, and there were two guys who are affiliated with MASBA that I never knew. And they were in one of these conferences for the TASB educational, the in-service stuff. And there was about 75 or 80 people in there, and about 70 of them were white, like me, and maybe 40 of them were men, like me. And these two leaders of MASBA were starting to talk about academic education issues and cultural issues, and it was pretty tough. And in fact, one by one, the white guys started leaving the meeting. Thanks. And I look around and I'm one of the few white guys left. I love the presentation. And I thought that I had seen an ally. I could not wait to get back to Katie and tell my superintendent, we are, as a district, moving to sue the state of Texas. And we're doing it because of our concern for economically disadvantaged minority children. We don't have any credibility if we don't join MASBA and support that group. And Katie joined, and you were executive director at that time. And very quickly, the superintendent agreed, and we joined that meeting. Because what I saw in MASBA was, here's a suburban district known as, silk stocking district. And we were the one district that was trying to bring this to a head. And boy, did we need an ally. We needed an ally to give us credibility. And I thought we had found it in MASBA. And that's where our relationship began at TASB. And at one point you invited me to, you may want to describe why you invited me there or whatever.
So George, you Mr. Scott, I apologize. Throughout the years, you've collected such rich data on academic performance of the students of the state of Texas that I distinctly recall, after seeing that fire that you had in your belly for what it was that MASBA was doing, that you had offered to come and share some of that data with us at one of our MASBA conferences. And then, if I'm not mistaken, it was shortly after that you came and presented some really jaw-dropping data to our board of directors at MASBA. I remember the officers and the legal counsel being in the room. Tell us about those two encounters and what it is that, how that fits with this story.
Well, I told my superintendent, I said, I run for school board. I'm known as obnoxious. I get elected by 6 votes after a recount. It was so close. And I said, I've made this contact with MASBA, and I think we have an opportunity now. I think we've taken a major step forward. So I made the presentation at that conference, and the words were nice. It was well received, and I felt confident. And it ended up with your inviting me to the MASBA board where your attorney was. And the truth of the matter is, you and I had a developing professional, personal commitment to the issues that we've been talking about here. And I was very excited about meeting with the executive committee. And I was about 7 or 8 minutes into the meeting, and I knew it was all dead. It was not going anywhere, because the attorney of the organization used to be in the belly of the beast with the Texas Education Agency. Mm-hmm. And you can't be in the belly of the beast and fight the beast. It just doesn't work that way. And so I made the presentation. My superintendent attended. You remember that. My superintendent attended that meeting along with another superintendent who was acting as a consultant to me. I brought 2 superintendents. He was actually had been superintendent of the Harris County Department of Education. Serious, significant outreach going on here. And I just had the feeling that there was no chemistry except from you. There was no fire. There was no so what. You know, it was more so what. It was very similar to the briefing that I gave to the executive leadership of TASB. I left the meeting with TASB. I think TASB is a great organization. It does a lot for business, for school districts in bidding and business orientation. But TASB has a similar condition. They're just not willing to have institutional courage for at-risk disadvantaged children. And so that meeting ended with MASBA, and maybe you'll have to pick up. I left being greatly disappointed, knowing that the great hope that you and I had in the discussion had fallen by the wayside. It just was not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, it was certainly a disillusioning moment for this executive director. I knew the organization that I was coming into was not known for examining equity issues. It was known for tremendous gatherings of school board members at conferences. And so to change the culture, as our superintendent here in the Austin ISD would always say, culture eats strategy for lunch every day. And during your presentation, I could just see culture eating strategy. And it was clear to me at that point that maybe the organization that I was with was more interested in the adults in the room than in the kids in the room. As sad as it is to say that, but it is what it is.
Well, and we're going to get to, we've been at numbers. We spent most of our time on numbers, and in 5 or 6 or 7 minutes, we'll get back to numbers. But let's remember something here. Their side probably thinks that we think that we're going to change the world by putting 8 webinars up. And by the time the 8th week is up, the Red Sea will have parted and equity will be the buzzword. You and I are very experienced. We've been around the block. Okay. We know that that was not the end result here. Our goal was to do something, and your organization, having left MASBA and created this new organization, your organization has done something that no organization, no advocacy group in the state of Texas, and to my knowledge, similarly structured in the United States. And that is, you have decided to allow us to create a record that tells the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about 30 years of lying and deception, misrepresentation by the state that has horribly harmed disadvantaged, at-risk children, statistically dominated by children of color. And so our goal is at 8 weeks, we will have the story recorded in a way that it has never been recorded. And then we're going to take a break, and we're going to go and we're going to find that audience of one. We're going to find that national medium. We're going to find that civil rights organization. We're going to find that philanthropist who buys into our passion and has something that neither you or I have, and that's money. And we're one audience away from implementing a strategy that has a chance to produce results. And so basically what we're doing here is we are using the leading statewide organizations in the state of Texas, TASA, TASB, TALAS, MASBA, I'm not good with the acronyms, the Black School Board Caucus and the Black School Educators. It's not as easy to pronounce as MASBA, Anyway, we're using their districts, and in using those districts, we are hitting major districts: Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, the big dogs, El Paso of Texas. We're hitting major dominant Latinx students, Brownwood, Isleta, others. We're hitting students that have a significant African American student population. We will have created the story and the documentation by week 8. And we're going to take that out, and we're going to try to find that audience of one.
There we go.
And the institutions, I hope, will come to the reality that maybe they need to ask themselves some imposing questions.
So, Mr. Scott, are we ready to jump into a presentation here? On the screen, we see the districts that comprise TALAS, the Texas Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents, and also of MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association. As we see here, those districts are Denton, El Paso, Fabens near El Paso, Fort Worth, Garland in the Dallas area, Houston, Manor, far San Juan Alamo in South Texas, Tornillo, which is near El Paso, and Isleta, which is in El Paso. So we have quite a gathering here, quite a group of districts to study. Mr. Scott, we'll let you jump into what is it we're seeing here.
Well, we've agreed that we were going to start every seminar on numbers, laying the foundation. And the foundation is that the state of Texas has created a system that establishes an academic metrics called approach. And if a student achieves the approach standard, they have passed the test and the state has met its constitutional burden, it presumes, for the diffusion of knowledge and closing the achievement gap. And as we've shown in the...
I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're seeing all these numbers, and you're suggesting that if the state gets a student, I'm looking at 6th grade math, for instance, 36.8% of students, 36.8% of the questions, if they are answered correctly, that the state of Texas says it has met its constitutional burden of providing an equitable education?
Well, it's not so important what I say. That's what Commissioner McMarath says. And you were at that meeting, and we've documented that. The answer to the question is yes. And you look, the math standards generally tend to be lower. Okay. The language standards are a little bit higher theoretically, but look, by the time you get to the end of course, remember, students take 5 end of course tests, and they're supposed to pass them to graduate. We're not going to get heavily into individual graduation committees, but look at the standards for algebra, biology, and history that is required to pass the test. Look at the standard, 60, 61, 63% in algebra, biology, US history to hit grade level. Okay? That is at high school. And so one of the things that we've asked ourselves individually, and one of the messages that we'll be taking as we find that audience of one is, do these organizations, will MASBA, will TALAS, will TASA, will TASB, will the other 2 groups, would they make an institutional statement that says it is immoral and unethical and unconscionable that the state of Texas defines its constitutional close the achievement gap at a standard that you see in the white on red? Why won't they at least take an organizational position that says our disadvantaged children are worth vastly more than 36.8% of the right questions on math in 6th grade, or 38% of the questions right in biology, or 60% of the questions right in biology to pass, to meet grade level. The absence of institutional courage. I was going to say integrity, but I'm not going to use that word. So I'm going to say institutional courage. And by implying that I was going to use that word, it doesn't mean that I'm still using it. If you want to get beyond that rhetoric, you're smarter than I am. These groups have sat silently. I have met with the leadership of TASB. I have met with the leadership of MASBA. I have met individually with leaders of school boards around the state of Texas. You have too. It's the reason we share this passion. So the bottom line of every number is that the state of Texas has created a passing standard to lie to federal courts, to lie to state courts, to lie to parents, and tragically, most important, to lie to children that they're protecting their future academic lives. That's what this table means. All the numbers are just filling in the gaps.
Mr. Scott, appreciate your willingness to do that. I'm seeing here now that this chart begins focusing on the percent of students who are tested who are below grade level. Tell us what we're looking at here.
So we're looking at the districts of these two groups, okay? And you see Latino, economic disadvantage, at risk, and retesters. Those are the four groups. If we looked at some different districts, if we looked at other demographics, we would see better numbers. But we're focused on these demographics in particular. 35% of the students in Denton who took the English 1 test in 1819 were Latinx. 56% were below grade level. 34% of the students who took the English 2 test in 2018-19 were Latinx. 61% were below grade level. That's where the approach standard comes into play. You can be at approach, you can pass the test, you can be recorded as having passed the test. And if you don't do a calculation on the Tapper report or the former AEIS report, if you don't do Jethro Bodine math, or if you don't disaggregate it, you don't really focus on the fact of the percent that are below grade level. So look at Fort Worth. I will tell you, one of the two people that made that presentation that just so inspired me that I'm talking about at TASB was from Fort Worth. 88% of the kids in 2018-19 were economically disadvantaged, and 67% were below grade level. You know,
we don't want to pick on anyone, but my eye is always drawn to the highest and the lowest number. So I'm looking, for instance, at the Manor ISD. If I'm understanding your numbers correctly, what this tells me is that 60% of those who were tested in English 1 in the Manor ISD were Latinx students. Over 2/3 of the students tested in the Manor ISD were Hispanic or Latinx. And that of those, 68% in English 1 and 67% in English 2 failed, meaning more than
no, they were below grade level.
We're below grade level. So,
but see, that was a verbal slip on your part. You know what you were saying. Let me put some context to that verbal slip, and I'm not making fun of you, buddy.
Go for it.
Okay. The state of Texas depends upon that.
Yeah.
That is, the state of Texas wants to think that the passing the test is worth more than it is. You did us a favor with that little slip. So now you've got one slip. If I make a slip, you got one coming.
There we go. So I'll try to word it correctly then again. So 67% of the students in the Manor ISD who took English 1 and English 2 were Latinx students. That's what we used to call Hispanic students. And in that district, 67 to 68%, meaning more than 2/3 were found to be below grade level.
That's the numbers, the total numbers, the whole numbers, and that's the tragedy of what we are fighting.
So, Mr. Scott, there's another number on this chart that leaps at me, and that is when we start looking at the number of retesters. For instance, I'm following Manor ISD over retesters to 99%. Help us understand what a retester is so that we know what this means, that 99% of students are below grade level who are retesters.
A retester is that they may be taking it as a chronological 10th grader. They may be taking it as a repeating 9th grader. They may have been passed on to some other level, but they have not passed. They took the test at least once, English 1 or English 2,
okay,
and they flunked it. Graduation requires that they pass the test or they go through an individual graduation committee process.
Okay.
So these are students that are taking the test again. What this shows at every school district, and it's going to be true for Katy, it's going to be true for Fort Bend. We've looked at all these districts. Katy is my district. It has high levels of affluence and substantial levels of economic disadvantage. It's a changing district, but the common denominator is students that get to the 9th grade and flunk an English 1 test. Students that get there and don't get 50%, 56% of the questions right to pass the test, okay, have to take it again.
Okay.
And they may take it again. And at some point, if they haven't passed it, a committee will come in, sprinkle some magic dust remediation, and if they haven't dropped out of school by then, they'll figure a way. The retesters is the saddest part of this. It is a confirmation. Look at that. 28% of the students who took English 1 in Fort Worth ISD were retesters.
Wow.
99,000 students who were in 2015-16 in a public school in the state of Texas were not in a public school in the state of Texas in 2018-19, their chronological senior year. And the state of Texas has put out a self-serving, non-audited fairy tale about those 99,000 students. Some of it's good, some of it is assertion, some of it is unedited. The fact of the matter is, when you look at students who are not retesters, and you see 40 and 50 and 60% not passing English 1 or English 2, you know what they are? They're retesters next year. The reason I put so much emphasis on English 1 and English 2 is that the performance standards have been manipulated to ridiculous levels, but they're not as low as U.S. history, biology, and algebra. You still have to get 56, 57%, something in that range to pass the test. So what you're seeing with these English 1 and English 2 tables, you're seeing the 9th and 10th grade classes. And it helps put in context the college data that we show, the low GPAs for first-year students that enroll in college, the de minimis graduation rates for economically disadvantaged students, and even advantaged students, students that are not economically disadvantaged. This table, this chart is an encapsulation of all that has gone wrong with the accountability system in the state of Texas. And it's made more tragic because the organizations that we're looking at will not stand up and say, this is evil.
Yeah.
This is sinister. This is outrageous. Why are we allowing the state of Texas to get by with this?
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
There you go.
Here we see post-secondary outcomes. So I'm led to understand that by setting up the system where students are not at grade level but are passing the test, this lower bar, that we continue to take students from one grade to the next level without the necessary knowledge and or skills for that grade level, and that has an impact on post-secondary outcomes after graduation from high school. What are we looking at here?
Well, what you're looking at is the byproduct of academic corruption that the state of Texas has imposed on K through 12. You're looking at the cumulative acquiescence of groups like MASBA, TALAS, and the others. You're looking at what the system has become. And there's two quick points that I want to make here. Why don't we not pick on Denton this time because they're at the top? Why don't we go to Fort Worth? Because I want to make a point about Fort Worth.
Okay.
Okay. Fort Worth has asterisks by 2-year and 4-year degrees. Okay. And that's because the state of Texas does FERPA, and they err on the side of not putting a number there that could theoretically be tracked back to individual students. Okay. But if you look at Fort Worth for 2010, 2009, 2008, you'll see that their numbers for earning 2-year degrees or 4-year degrees is somewhere in the 6% to 10% range. It just so happens in 2011, they were FERPA or masked out. But the bottom line to this is the students that are economically disadvantaged, okay, in Denton, 53% of the students who were economically disadvantaged ever enrolled in higher education. That means they went through the front door. But of that 53%, of that 53%, 39% never earned a certificate or never earned a degree. And of that 35.4%, of that 53.6 that enrolled, only 5.3% earned a 2-year degree, and only 8.5% earned a 4-year degree. That's how you read the table, all the way up, all the way down. And what you can see is that the number of non-economically disadvantaged students have a proportionately higher 4-year degree. A lot of the non-economically disadvantaged students don't enroll to community college. They go to universities, okay? But if you look at the university degrees from the economically disadvantaged and the non-economically disadvantaged, you see a fairly strong disparate equity gap. But even more importantly than that, when you look at the non-economically disadvantaged, you see that, let's take Denton now, back to that, 75.6% of the non-economically disadvantaged students, that's the second grouping, 75.6% did enroll somewhere in a college, according to this report. Of that, 41% never got a degree or a certificate. So 41% of 75% never got a degree, never got a certificate. These are economically non-economically disadvantaged. And of that, 29% got a college degree, a university degree. So even in the best case scenario, all of those approaching scores, all of those passing rates, all of the lipstick that is put on all of the makeup that is put on the passing scores by the TEA do not keep this human tragedy from happening. We've presented tables before, and they're available, where we put in a public information request to the Higher Education Board and said, we want to know by ethnicity and by enrolling college SAT, ACT scores, what percentage got degrees in 6 years. The one we produced is 2009-10. We're going to produce some more up to 2012-13. And what it shows is that, for instance, in 2009-10, I am really doing this from memory, but it's not that far off. You have something like 28,000 something kids who were classified as Hispanic enrolled in a enrolled in a higher education in a 2-year college, and the vast majority did not get a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree. No college SAT, ACT, these are open enrollment kids. And you can track that from the lowest of low SAT, no SAT, low SAT, higher, 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 higher. And what you see is that these kids may have passed English 1. They may have passed U.S. history, algebra, biology on these phony baloney standards that the TEA has done to serve its legal interest over the children's interest. But those lower standards and the higher passing rates that the TEA gets to assert does not make a difference when the kids get to higher education. That's connecting the dots. That's what that does.
Tremendous. Now we start looking at visualizing. Appreciate very much the introduction with all those tables, Mr. Scott. Now, through the help of Carlos, we're beginning to visualize those data. Here we see for all of the TALAS and MASBA officer districts, 6th grade reading. We take 6th grade as a representative grade because we know that 3rd grade reading levels are correlated to post-secondary success, but also to the number of jails that we're building here in Texas. 6th grade gives us now 3 years after that to continue working with these kids. What are the gaps that we're seeing here, Mr. Scott?
What you're seeing is how profoundly important the approach is to the state of Texas' reputation and insulating it from effective lawsuits in a federal courtroom. What you're seeing is, and again, let's go to Houston. 44% of the 6th grade students taking the reading test failed the test outright.
Wow.
30% were at the approach standard, and 25% met the threshold of grade level. So rather than reporting that 75% were below, I'm sorry, I was looking at Manor, I apologize. Houston, 44, 30, 26. So rather than reporting that Houston ISD, in unmistakable language, just out and out saying it, they say it, but there's an asterisk by it in effect. Rather than having a category that says students below grade level, 74%, they put students at approach is 56%, or whatever it is. Now, again, we've made this point before, Dr. Matthias. We could show some school districts, some demographic groups, and the numbers would not look that tragic. But we're not focused on kids that are going to Harvard, that are going to the University of Houston, making 4.0, 3.5. We're focused on the children who have historically been underserved, not represented, discriminated against, or in the words of William Wayne Justice back in 1972, when he ordered the Texas Education Agency to develop curricular programs and offerings that would compensate minority group children for past racial, ethnic isolation. I guarantee you, I never met William Wayne Justice. I know 2 people. I have 2 personal friends who were personal friends of William Wayne Justice. They've told me a lot about the guy. I can promise you, based on my friends who knew the guy personally, this chart is not what William Wayne Justice had in mind when he said compensate minority group children for past racial and ethnic isolation.
Shoot.
And if you, once you get to the ones with ethnic distribution, it's tragically more tragic.
What strikes me here, Mr. Scott, is simply seeing where 46% of students in 3 MASBA TALAS officer districts, namely Fabens, Fort Worth, and Far San Juan Alamo, 46% of Latinx 6th graders are outright failing reading by the time of 6th grade.
Well,
here we see math.
But a lot more pass the English 1 test. What's even more remarkable is look at the number of kids that are in 8th grade that are failing or below grade level in social studies and science, but the number of students who in the 11th, 10th, and 11th and 12th grade are passing U.S. history, biology, and algebra.
Wow. Math for sixth grade Latinx students, Mr. Scott, we're seeing very large gray bars on this. So that gray bar again represents the disparity between being at grade level and this much lower bar that the Texas Education Agency has created of approaching grade level, which means that they're passing the test even though they are far below grade level.
You know, to some degree, you're an ethicist. I mean, you're a preacher, okay? You're a reverend, you're a pastor. You believe in right and wrong. I happen to believe in that too. Okay. We used to think, before these tables that Carlos has created, we used to think of gray as being, well, he may go good, may go bad. This gray that Carlos has created is sinister. This, to me, this is not gray. This is wrong. When you establish a standard where the state of Texas gets to pretend that 65% in Fort Worth, not picking on Fort Worth, but why not? 65% of the students in Fort Worth pass the test, and you get to give yourself a blue ribbon or an equity stamp on that monstrous use of the English language. It's tragedy. You know, Carlos, your assistant, you're our key helper in this. He's created the perfect table to demonstrate the impact of the dishonesty.
Incredible. When we see, you mentioned Fort Worth, when we see in Fort Worth that hardly 1 in 5 sixth grade Latinx students is at grade level in sixth grade math, that is astounding.
But don't worry, in language that we would understand, there's going to be a mathematical road to Damascus by the time they get to algebra, and it's all going to be okay.
Incredible.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Incredible. Here we see data that are segregated by race and ethnicity for every set of bars. The first bar is for Asian students. The second bar is for white students. The third bar for Latinx or Hispanic students. The fourth bar for African American students. So this is where gaps begin to be especially evident. Mr. Scott, any reflections as you see these? In some districts, very glaring gaps.
We have been through this with our previous 5 webinars. We're going to be through it with 2. Let me go ahead and tell them now. The last one, the top 20, what I'm calling the top 20. We're going to do some things that we've not even done yet. Okay, but what this shows is, let's go back to 1993. That's when Senate Bill 7 was passed. And we're not digging up history for the sake of just proving that we know history. There is a continuous chain between Senate Bill 7 in 1993 and today in this table. Senate Bill 7 said the academic achievement gap will be closed. It said that. The academic achievement gap will be closed for at-risk populations, economic disadvantage. That was in response to William Wayne Justice, 21 years after he did it, saying you're going to compensate minority group children for past racial and ethnic isolation. TABS, teams. Then came TALAS. TALAS became the constitutional test. And Skip Mina, who was then the Commissioner of Education, we have a treatise. I hope we can get all this stuff uploaded at one point, but we have this publication from the Texas Education Agency in 1993, where Skip Mina, the Commissioner of Education, says the academic achievement gap will be closed. The Supreme Court, which had, sometimes my sense of humor is just snarky, but I'm not going to apologize. The Supreme Court in Texas had noted Marxist communist John Cornyn, Nathan Heck, Priscilla Owens on the Supreme Court of Texas in 1995. Obviously, conservative Republicans, okay? And they wrote in their 5-4 decision that was joined by Bob Gamage, a middle-of-the-road Democrat, that the state in TALAS has defined the contours of its constitutional duty, that the achievement gap will be closed. Now, Senate Bill 7 gave the state of Texas to determine that. When the federal court in January 2000 ruled, it said the equity gap shall be closed. There is a strong correlation between the standards of the TALAS test and achievement for closing, or for success in closing the achievement gap. That's 30, 25, 2 to 3 decades ago. And in 2018-19, your brilliant graphic guy, who I really like and respect, your graphic guy has taken some of my boring numbers and he has shown dramatically that the achievement gap 30 years later is enormous. And when you take into consideration that this achievement gap is dependent upon hoax academic standards, it magnifies the massive deception that the TEA has had. And I've posed this question before. If the children in black and gray, and that includes white kids and Asian kids, but it mostly affects the target group from our perspective of disadvantaged at-risk children. If they can't depend upon the officers of MASBA, if they can't depend upon the officers of TALAS, if they can't depend upon the officers of TASA and TASB, or the School Board Black Caucus, or the Black School Educators Association, if they can't turn to those leaders to at least acknowledge how dishonest this is, to whom can they turn? Hopefully we're going to find it. And I've thought, it's your job to cut me off, but I've thought of an analogy or a metaphor, whatever it is, analogy. I'm 72. I grew up in the era of the Watergate tapes in Vietnam. I was a young guy, 18, 17, 18, 19 maybe, in the Watergate tapes. And there were actually Republicans and conservatives who wanted Richard Nixon to destroy the Watergate tapes. If you don't have that institutional memory, you have to go Google it and remember. Why didn't he just destroy the tapes that had his magic voice acknowledging that he was a federal criminal? Why didn't he destroy the tapes? The sad thing here is this: there are many organizations and many superintendents and many advocacy groups that want to do away with testing. They want to destroy the Watergate tapes all these years later, in effect. My position is you do not want to destroy testing, because these testings are more powerful than the Watergate tapes that ended a presidency. This shows the magnitude, the depth, the scope of the state's 30 years of deception. And the truth of the matter is, because of our efforts and because of the efforts of some others, but particularly the Texas Latino school boards, we're going to make sure that the history of this deception is chronicled in a way that it has never been chronicled before. And maybe we will find that audience of one. But if you have historical perspective, these are the most dramatic graphics that go to the heart and soul of the total deception and the total harm that has been done to children.
Incredible. We've spoken through gaps in sixth grade reading. Here is sixth grade math in TALAS, MASBA officer districts. I mean, it's very striking. In districts like Denton ISD, we see a spread from 28% of students, of African-American students who are at grade level versus 76% of Asian students at grade level, a spread of 48 points.
It's every graph is going to be different by how high the gray and how high the black goes. But we're not going to be discussing how low is the black for disadvantaged kids. How low is the gray? We'll be talking about that for others, but not for the disadvantaged kids.
Speaking of disadvantaged kids, here we're seeing at-risk equity gaps in each set of bars. The first bar is for not at-risk students, and the second bar is for at-risk students. As we see, we can pat ourselves on the back. We are teaching our not at-risk students relatively well here in Texas, but it's the at-risk students who are really suffering. We see it in Fabens or El Paso, Fort Worth ISD, 9 to 11% of at-risk sixth grade students being at grade level in reading.
Well, I'm gonna quibble a little bit on the first part of that statement, and we can do that. We're friends. We can do that. When you say they're doing the economic, one of the things that we don't focus on a lot, okay, is we're focused on equity, because the story of equity is what's driving our lives at this particular point in time. But when you say they're doing a fairly good job with the non-economically disadvantaged, let's look at the passing standards to achieve grade level. I have put in requests before where in Katy, okay, it was before I was a board member, I'd put in a public information request, 1,000 here, 1,200 here. Pretty soon you're talking about money, but I'd get a statistician to do it. And if you look at the upper level ranges of the STAR, at that time it was tax, won't be any different now, but if you look at those that are at the mastery level or the high grade level, and you pull the data that says, okay, how did the kids do on English 1, English 2? How did they on the tax test? How did they do on the PSAT? How did they do on the SAT? Okay, when you start looking at the upper levels of performance asserted by the state, and you start looking at the metrics like SAT, PSAT, AP, advanced placement, when you start looking at those metrics, it falls apart up at the top too. It is systemically harmful to children. We're just focused on the constitutional component of disadvantaged at-risk kids.
There we go.
But you're not worried about that quibble.
Well, I'm with you, and I apologize because my statement too tends to overlook the dark gray area of each of the first bars, which is a considerable number of students. Those are real human lives that are being passed from one grade to the next, even though they are below grade level. They've passed the test, but they are below grade level and lack the necessary knowledge and skills for the subsequent grade.
That's it.
Here we see English 2, which is the final end of year course for the students who remain in their course of studies, who
don't drop out.
Right.
For the most part.
And so here we see by the time of English 2, roughly the sophomore year of high school, how large those gaps are.
It's basically the same. Okay. I've stopped producing tables on Algebra 1 U.S. history and biology because it just takes too much. You have to dive deeper into the weeds to be able to explain why 75% passing rates or 40% mastery rates on U.S. history or biology is not good. Okay, and but English 1, English 2, you don't have to be a statistician, you don't have to be a psychometrician. You can just be Joe Blow six pack. Incidentally, I'm not a statistician or a psychometrician, so I'm Joe Sixpack that's had a lot of training.
50 years later, though, what we're seeing is that 50 years after Judge William Wayne Justice, that gaps have not yet been closed, as we see here. What we enjoy doing here at MASBA is Carlos has come up with a new visualization here of the gaps over time to see, are we closing the gaps in our Texas public schools? And what we see here is that in each one of the 10 MASBA TALAS officer districts, the gaps continue to grow. An example, boy, hate to put anyone on the spot, but here in the Garland ISD, we see where the gap started very low. And then by the time of end of course testing, that's a considerable gap. We also have such trends in math as well. Thanks, Carlos. We see here that there's one anomaly that the Isleta ISD, pictured in brown, is succeeding in closing gaps from one grade level to the next in math, in contrast to all other MASBA TALAS officer districts. The effect on post-secondary studies then, here is Mr. Scott, a visualization of the data that you presented to us in table form. What strikes me here is the dark gray area of each column then. Each set of bars represents all students. The second is non-economically disadvantaged, and the third is economically disadvantaged students. But in each of those bars, we see this dark gray area, which represents the percent of students who enrolled in post-secondary education, who enrolled in 2-year and 4-year programs, but who within 6 years never received a degree.
Now let's point out here on Fort Worth, because that is something that you and I have no control over. The state of Texas masked that because they had a concern about FERPA. And I want to say in advance, I don't think I have the highest, utmost respect for the folks at the higher ed board, and they made a judgment. But if you look at the prior years for Fort Worth, those numbers are running about 6 and 12% getting a 2-year or a 4-year degree for the economically disadvantaged students. It's just that in that particular year, there was something that flagged that the higher ed board had to mask, but it doesn't change the trend lines that you clearly see in prior reports.
What I see here, Mr. Scott, is kudos to us for encouraging our students to pursue higher education. Shame on us for perhaps not preparing them as we might. I'm seeing in the Isleta ISD, that dark gray area of each bar is more than 50%. The majority of all students, non-economically disadvantaged students and economically disadvantaged students in the Isleta ISD are leaving college, are leaving higher education with no degree.
See, I'm older than you. I'm 72. And I'm way more cynical. So when you say that kind of statement, you're the one that has brought this up, okay? I'm not sure about that. I think there is a high level of incentive to get kids who they know are not going to succeed into college for college debt. College debt is your issue. I'm just kind of reminding you of that. You look at the ones that are dropping out. You look at the ones that are, remember those numbers that said 60 and 70% are hitting college doors?
Yeah.
40, 50, 30% have no certificate, no degree. Their nobility to me would be based upon an evaluation of how much college debt those leavers leave.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That'll be startling. I know we always try to end within an hour. I'll just point everyone who's with us to our website, tlsba.org/research is where you'll find this monograph. It also contains, as you'll see here, various bar charts that Carlos has developed to show us how many, what numbers of students are going into higher education at every high school, at every MASBA TALAS officer district. On the right-hand side, we see their grade point average, their GPA after a single semester of higher education, to give us some idea of how well we are preparing them. It's those red, the long red segments that give us an idea. Those are the students who are failing out of higher education. Those who are in orange are in jeopardy of failing out. So we really, as education leaders in Texas, need to be paying attention to this. You can find it all at tlsba.org/research. Mr. Scott, we're coming up on the hour. Final thoughts as we reflect on how it is that we're doing at closing gaps in our Texas public schools?
We're not closing gaps at any meaningful level. Two, we've got two more of these to do. I can't wait for the eighth and final one where we do the top 20, because it's going to give us an opportunity to combine all 7 weeks prior into sort of not a finale, but a finale of these two webinar series. And then I think we're going to make a serious, we'll probably take a break from what our discussions. We'll probably take a break, and we're going to make a serious effort to find that right audience of one to carry this effort forward. It has to go forward, hopefully.
Let's do it. In the meantime, I just want to conclude with a call to action for all who are hearing this. Our students, our children, and our grandchildren are counting on us. 50 years after Civil Order 5281, we can see how it is that gaps have not closed in Texas. We need the help of all education leaders, including the officers and directors of the Texas Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents and of the Mexican American School Boards Association. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could all come together for the good, not of the adults in the room, but for the good of all of the students who are counting on us? If not us, who? If not now, when? If not for the sake of our students, why? Let's do this for them.
Well said.
Mr. Scott, appreciate very much for joining us. For those who are joining us, then come back next week and we'll have similar data on the officer districts of the Texas Association of Black School Educators and on the Texas Caucus of Black School Board Members. Have a great day.